Hi there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from Gavin Degraw, titled Make a Move. Now, as some of you know, the end of the year is coming up. It's always an important time for music critics because we're the ones expected to put together our year-end list to the general indifference of musicians and audiences alike. And for me, that means I'm going to be making 4 lists this year. My top 10 albums of the year, my top 25 songs of the year, and in the continuing tradition from my blog, the top 10 best and worst hit songs of the year. Now, these two last lists are drawn from the year-end Billboard Hot 100 lists, and it's also the only time I will ever make a worst of list, because let's face it, I don't cover all of the terrible albums and terrible songs that get released throughout the year, and a worst of list really only kind of works with a limited field. In any case, I've been making my year-end best and worst list of hit songs since 2011, but today I want to look at 2012, when I first came across Not Over You by Gavin Degraw. And I'll be honest, it was an early frontrunner to make my year-end list of the best hit songs of the year. But it didn't make the list, and a year later, I'm kind of happy I didn't put it there. I had gone through a breakup close to this time last year, and Not Over You did really speak to me on a very visceral level, but at the same time, I was fairly certain that my artistic and critical integrity was somewhat compromised, and I felt that certain that once some of my own personal angst had faded, I wouldn't like the song as much. And surprise, surprise, I was right. Now, don't get me wrong, Not Over You by Gavin Degraw still represents what he and One Republic frontman Ryan Tedder can do at their absolute best, with reasonably punchy songwriting and a lot of bombast that toes the line between sophisticated and classy and raw and emotional. And yet, even with that song, I didn't feel that I knew Gavin Degraw's material very well, so I took a deeper look through his decade-deep discography and before this particular album. Overall, he's not bad, but I'm not sure he's the kind of act that I would actively seek out in most cases. His songwriting is quite strong, at least enough for the most part, but I'm not entirely surprised that it's taken until fairly recently for him to break into the mainstream, because the strident and occasionally gratingly nasal nature of his voice, it doesn't always fit with his instrumentation, which can sometimes feel a little bit too small and restrained for his vocals. But after the success of Not Over You and his collaboration with Ryan Tedder, it appeared that Gavin Degraw had gone and recruited all manner of additional producers to pump up his new album with a lot more energy, trying to switch up his style a little bit. And while I would normally say that a move in this direction might smack of selling out, it's not intrinsically a bad thing, depending what direction they choose to go. A lot of critics made the statements that Gavin Degraw had kind of been stuck in a holding pattern for the past little while, so maybe a change of format would be good for him. So, with that in mind, I picked up Make a Move, and I took a look at it. So how'd it turn out? It's okay. Honestly, I can't help but feel a little bit disappointed with this album because, well, it's not really bad objectively by any stretch of the mind. It's just not all that special or memorable, as there are just too many niggling elements that just don't work here. It's an album that's less defined by everything that it does right and more by all the little things that just don't work, and it drives me nuts that I'm coming to this conclusion. Believe me, after Not Over You, I wanted to see more from this guy. I wanted him to impress me, and this album really doesn't. So let's start with Gavin Degraw himself, and I'll give him this. He's an emotionally intense singer. I wouldn't quite say that his voice gives him the greatest emotional range or nuance, but you can buy into his authenticity and that his emotions that he's delivering, they come from a very real place. For me, it can overcome the sometimes clinically overwritten nature of some of his lyrics, and it can imbibe them with some real passion and emotional resonance. But he's a singer that works well with a lot of volume and a lot of air, and when he attempts to hit the same notes in his quieter range as he does a couple times in this album, he's not especially strong, and I couldn't help but wince at a few of the moments. And the auto-tune that's piled on really does not help matters. It just comes across as obtrusive. Now, what's more noteworthy is the songwriting. This has always been probably the biggest strength of Gavin Degraw's material, because on a technical level, he's a pretty solid songwriter with a good grasp of rhyme scheme and melody. And while he doesn't really innovate with his songwriting topics, he writes a lot about bad relationships or failing relationships or broken relationships, he's solid enough when he's singing about love and heartbreak that it's mostly pretty good. The problems that start arising are whenever whenever Gavin Degraw wants to come across like he's some sort of tough guy, mostly on the latter half of this album, mostly because he's completely unconvincing in the role. The closest he gets to actually making it work here is on Heartbreak, which is a rather sour song, but it does kind of work, where he tries to play off the fact that he's been heartbroken so many times that he's completely detached from the emotional experience. But doesn't that undercut the emotional resonance? Oh, I don't know, the previous half of the album? It even gets worse on tracks like Need, where he tries to convince a girl to dump a bad relationship and just go with him, and I've never liked that kind of song. Or on songs like Different for Girls or Leading Man. On both the latter songs, he just comes across like a real asshole as he tries to play the swaggering rock star alpha male dude, and it's just an awkward fit for him. Now, the frustrating problem with that is, instrumentally, the last two songs on the album are probably some of the stronger ones on the record, thanks to producer Kevin Rudolph, who lends some of his charismatic punch and rock edge to an album that really needs all the energy that it can get. When, for the most part, the instrumentation is arguably one of the better areas on this album. It tends to remind me of Train, and my issue with Train was always the bad songwriting, so one could argue that Gavin Degraw fixes this element here. But here's where we get to the one noteworthy and problematic feature on this album. It is a record very much defined by the producers working on each track over the leading artist, and that can be a problem when the production isn't uniformly strong. Now sure, Ryan Tedder and Kevin Rudolph both contribute good material, and Julian Emery does a fine enough job with every little bit, but too many of the songs just feel overproduced and very cluttered at the upper end of the mix, with too much clattering percussion to really let the melody sink in. It makes the songs feel very top-heavy in the vein of Avicii's album from earlier this year, as most of the primary backbeats are just too lightweight to give any of the songs any real emotional heft or weight. It doesn't really help matters that whenever a choral arrangement comes in as some backing vocals, they just sound thin and really out of place, kind of chintzy if I'm going to be honest. And all the various producers on this album don't really add to any sort of consistent listening experience for the record as a whole, and that's a real problem when you've got Gavin Degraw sticking with mostly conventional songwriting topics. And this takes us probably to the biggest problem with Make a Move. It doesn't learn any of the lessons from the previous album's success. Now look, Not Over You did gain a fair bit from Ryan Tedder's production, which added some dramatic weight, but it was ultimately a song that was carried on emotional resonance and Gavin Degraw showing some vulnerability, and it was supported by a really killer hook. This album though, it just doesn't have any of that emotional resonance. Very little of the vulnerability and pathos seem to go in the opposite direction in that note, and very little hooks that I'm gonna really remember. Even Every Little Bit, which is probably arguably my favorite track on the album, outside of the title track, I mean, it just feels like a constant build-up to a payoff that never really comes, and I gotta admit, I found that disappointing. Look, ultimately, this album just leaves me feeling rather lukewarm on Gavin Degraw, and it's not an album that I can easily recommend or say that it's all that essential. Honestly, if you're a fan, there are a few passable tracks that aren't bad, but not much else besides that. Otherwise, look, Make a Move doesn't really have any consistently bad songs per se, but it's not all that special either. To me, it feels like an album that was composed by a selection of producers throwing ideas at a wall and trying to find something that will stick. And unfortunately, not a lot does. Right now, I'm sorry, I'm going to give it a 5 out of 10, and only a recommendation if you're a fan of Gavin Degraw, and even with that, I don't think it's his best work. And at this point, 5 albums into his career, look, I can appreciate Gavin Degraw trying to switch up the formula and try something new, but with the results of this album, maybe you should go back to what works, because it didn't work here. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be very grateful. If there's any other albums you'd like for me to cover, or if there's anything I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'd be more than happy to take a look. Until then, see you next time.